All right, in the first part, we just said that what happens is Russia gets its butt kicked in the Crimean War. And as such, it knows it needs to change. And one of the things it will do is it will outlaw in about 1861. Notice the irony of that date. We'll talk about that. About 2 years ahead of the U.S. emancipation of slaves. They will outlaw serfdom. But this will not have quite the desired impact they were hoping. First of all, what's industrialization look like in Russia? Well, one of the things is there's not, unlike England, which you guys will remember had a large stash of capital left over maybe from the slave trade, from various, there have been various things that helped it out, but England has a lot of private capital. Russia doesn't have that, so it's going to require government support. You're going to notice there's a parallel with that with Japan. It too uses government support. Number two, they built a Trans-Siberian Railroad, which pushed for iron and coal from their eastern sectors out in Asia. This right here in red is represented as the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and it will open up Asia, open up this part of Russia to modern-day Russia. And you're going to learn it will cause Russia in the 1900s to become actively involved, more actively involved in politics out here dealing with China and that part of, and Japan and that part of the world. As time goes on, in between 1892 and 1903, the finance minister actually tries to do a couple of reforms. One of the reforms is he puts high tariffs to protect Russian industries. Now, it sounds good on the surface, right? You know, you put high taxes so they can always undersell foreign competition. He encouraged Western investors. The problem is that these Western investors end up owning Russian businesses, and the wealth that's accumulated from those doesn't go to Russians, it goes to Westerners, particularly some British and Germans, and there'll be some French there as well. One of the bad things that happens for Russia is she ends up being a debtor nation. In other words, she owes money to these Western European countries who have done the investing there, and industrial loans begin to pile up to other countries. So, what does Russia do? Another part of this industrialization is by 1900, though on the positive side, let me say this, on the positive side, by 1900 it's one of the top 5 in the world in steel, oil, and textiles. But the problem is it's a leader due to its size and being population, not necessarily its efficiency. So it's not efficiency that's making Russia successful, it's just her raw, massive size. Unfortunately, in Russia, agriculture is still inefficient. In other words, they have illiterate peasants. You're going to see there's a contrast with Japan coming up. They have no desire or ability to advance themselves. The peasants don't. And it's very different from the West militarily. Although they try to industrialize, their military officers are still seen as part of the aristocracy. By that I mean they're still seen as belonging to the wealthy landowners, and there's no growing middle class. So you end up with inefficient military officers and not the middle class that's going to spur your economic and industrial growth. So they can't increase money and influence because the reason the middle class cannot increase its influence is because most businesses are state-sponsored. Most of them are sponsored by the government. Okay, so Russia's in a rough situation. So what happens? What's protest and revolution like in Russia? Well, I'm about to give you a large number of groups who are unhappy with the Russian government. First off, angry peasants. Frequent famines have really made them upset. I've told you guys this before. If you want to make your people angry, starve them. Starve mothers and fathers and their children, and let the mothers and fathers see their children suffer, and they become angry. They're also annoyed at having to pay redemption payments. Now, you may or may not remember what redemption payments were. Redemption payments, if you read the book, were when they were when they were freed from serfdom, the idea was that the landowners, and they also, some of them got property, the landowners needed to be compensated for their losses. So they had to pay redemption payments back to these wealthy aristocrats, which in many cases had rendered the peasants almost like serfs again. Or they had ended up having to give what little they had back to the aristocrats and had become serfs again. I mean, not in law, but in practice. The business and professionals, they voice upset with the system. They want freedom in schools, press, liberal reforms. But they're not as aggressive as the peasants and some of these other groups we're about to look at. Okay? Next up, the intelligentsia. Now, intelligentsia simply is a word that means the intellectuals, those who've read a lot and gone to school a lot. They can frequently in Russian history be the most radical, but what's hard on the Tsar is they're also the most articulate. In other words, they're the best spoken. They're well spoken. And as such, they can influence people and policy a lot more than you might think. The intelligentsia of radicalism inspired terrorism. We, in modern day history, in our time, often associate terrorism with the Middle East or with radical religious groups. It's not really where it first started. At least in the modern times, it actually started in Russia. That was where we saw our first terrorists. Remember what we talked about with the Tsar? I said all the way back in 1825 with the Decembrist Revolution. Remember that? We just did it in the last part, first part of this one. With the Decembrist Revolution, there's a move by the Tsars have a reaction. They can give in to some of the demands or they can get more strict, and they decide to become more strict, more repressive. Censorship is on the press. Political meetings can't be had. Alexander II is assassinated, so they target minority groups, particularly Jews. There are pogroms, which are forced immigration of Jews out of Russia. The intelligentsia want to continue to industrialize, but they fear becoming materialistic like Western Europe. In other words, they look at Western Europe and say, you guys are a little too concerned about your stuff. We don't want to be like you. Anarchists. Now, these are the first guys who really could become terrorists. They want to abolish all formal government. They want to get rid of all formal government. Now, if you've read the book, what is it? Suddenly it escapes me with Piggy and the Flies and, it'll come to me. Lord of the Flies, that's it. Lord of the Flies, you've read about what can happen when you start to move to anarchy. No control, no rules on anyone. Things can get out of hand. And there's also a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin, and he's the guy whose picture I included here. Lenin believes we can have a proletariat revolution without actually having achieved the middle class. This puts him in definite opposition to Karl Marx. Karl Marx felt you needed to go through industrialization first, and Russia was not industrialized. But Lenin feels he can do it by being an intellectual who leads it. And he encouraged the ironically named Bolsheviks, which literally means majority party, even though he was the minority party, and his opposition, I think this is sort of funny, it's one of those moments Machiavelli talked about where if you keep repeating something and people start to believe it, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. He actually nicknamed his opponents the Mensheviks meaning minority group, while he kept the title Bolsheviks, meaning majority group, for himself. All right, working class, what little there is, the industrialized workers get upset. They form labor unions and have strikes, and negative working conditions are really bad for them, and revolution becomes inevitable. But the czars survive, or have survived, for a long time because their opposition is, what I asked you to write there, not united. Their opposition is not united. And there's a conservative government is able to repress them. And conservative, again, here means, please understand, means monarchy. the czars are able to repress them quite harshly. Okay, but it'll reach its peak in 1905, and we'll grab that in the next